Hi everyone, it's Katrina from the Alluring Bead Boutique and the Bead Mat. Welcome to my design channel, and today I'm going to do a little bit of a partial tutorial. We're going to be working on a bracelet, and we're going to start with some components. And the component we're going to start with is this long strand of ladder stitched together bugle beads. So these bugles are just some check bugles that came off of a large hank of bugle beads, and each one is approximately 5 centimeters long, or 5 millimeters, I'm sorry, excuse me. And to create this strand, I just started ladder stitching, but if you'll notice how they're sticking together so beautifully, and they're nice and sturdy, and there's no gaps in between them. What I did to achieve that was I reinforced each bead as I added it. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So to start with, when you start ladder stitch, you just pick up 2 beads onto your needle, just like this. And I apologize, but I've got a really long piece of fire line on my needle. And that is so that I don't have to add thread in as I work this strip up. So you bring them down, and for right now, I'm just going to leave a little tiny bit of a tail thread down here. A couple of inches is fine. We're going to pass back through the first one we picked up one more time. Oh, sorry guys, I'm having trouble with my poking device here. We'll pass back through the very first one more time and slowly pull our thread all the way through. Now, bugle beads are really sharp on the edges. So what I like to do is when I start getting close, I take my finger like so and I hold both beads in my hand. Then I pull my working thread tight. And like I said, I'm just leaving a little tiny tail thread here. So now I'm coming out of the top of that bead. I'm going to come back down through the second bead, pull all the way through. And then to secure this bead nicely, and to make sure that I don't wind up with a gap later on, I'm going to go ahead and pass through what becomes now the first bead in my row, and come back down through the second bead in my row one more time. And that gives me a nice, secure start to my beadwork. I don't know if you have ladder stitched bugle beads before, but a lot of times as you're working along, they will pull a small gap in between the beads, and I really don't want that to happen because I don't want to have to go back through and reinforce this entire long strip at one time. So I'm going to choose to reinforce as I work along. So because I left such a short tail thread, I'm going to go ahead and just tie a little knot, just a little 2 overhand knots right there on my tail thread. And that's just to give myself a little added security that nothing's going to work loose later. Alright, so now that I've tied that knot, it kind of positions my thread a little towards the first bead again. So now I'm just going to come down through that second bead towards the left one more time. And this time when I pull, I'm going to give it a sharp little tug and situate that knot inside of my bead. First, I'm going to make sure I get the tail thread out. And I'm just going to give it a nice little tug, and I can feel that knot pop inside of that bugle bead. So now I can just hold the tail thread out of my way, and I'm ready to move on. So let's go ahead and add a couple of beads. So you'll pick up a bead. The thread's exiting the bottom towards me. So I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to come back through that bead from the opposite side. And when I start pulling through, as my bead gets closer, or my thread starts coming to a halt, I should say. Well, let's see what I did here, folks. I don't even know what I did. Okay. As it gets close to where it's going to pull on my thread, I pinch that bead and hold it beside the other one, and then I snug my thread into position. And this keeps my thread from scrubbing hard on those sharp edges. So now I have to come up through the bead I just added. The working thread is here. I'm going to go through this bead I just added from the same side to complete my stitch. But now, like I said, to make this strip, I'm reinforcing each time. So I'm going to come back down through the middle bead from the same side my working thread's on. And then I got a position to add my next bead by passing back up through that bead I just added from the same side my working thread is on to the opposite side. And pull my thread nice and snug. I'll show you a couple more. So I'm going to pick up a bead. The working thread is now at the top of the bead I just added, so I'll come from the bottom to the top with my new bead on the needle. And start pulling. And once I get close to where the bead is close enough to where I can grab it with my fingers, I just put both beads, all the beads in my fingers like this and pull snug. So now that bead sits right beside the previous bead. Sorry for the glare. Now I have to come down through the bead I just added. My working thread is here at the top. I'm going to come from top to bottom through that bead I just put on. And then I'm going to reinforce again by going through the previous bead from bottom to top. And get into position again into the new bead from top to bottom. And each time you add a bead, you'll be alternating the directions of your stitch. So now my working thread is at the bottom of my beadwork. So when I pick up my new bead, I'll come through this previous bead from top to bottom. And this just works out. It's really great for a lazy Saturday afternoon, which it is right here. I'm watching some shows on Netflix, and I'm just sitting here and building my little strips. So now I can go back up through my new bead from bottom to top, and then just reinforce by passing through my previous bead, top to bottom, and then get ready to add my new bead by going up through the last bead, bottom to top. So by working it this way with a nice long thread, I'm guaranteed to have a beautiful, secure strip of ladder stitched beads without any gaps in between them, so that when I later want to put a bracelet together with these strips, everything's all ready for me. And there's no gaps, and it looks really professional and pretty. And I just love these little graphite looking beads. They may be hematite color. I don't really know because I got them in an estate sale and they were super cheap. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and keep working until I have two strips that are even in length. The first strip I made is about 6.5 inches long, because if I want to, say I have equal strips here and I want to stitch in between these two pieces, I'm going to lose some of my length. So I went ahead and made my strips just a little bit extra long, because you'll always lose a little bit of length as you put beadwork like this together. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and jump off. You guys can hit pause and work on your ladders until you have two beautiful strips made of equal length. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about what we want to do next. Hi guys, so I'm back, and I just wanted to show you quickly how you can double check your length of both of your strips, and then I'm going to show you how to end off your first strip. So first of all, I already had one made, so I can show you. I'm going to take my needle and run it through the beginning bead on both of my strips. And then as I bring them down along this way, I can tell that let me just switch hands here. I can tell that I still need one more bead on my current strip. When I measure them out, I'm just one little bead short down here. It's easier to see if I lay it down. I may be 2 beads short. Hold on. Alright, so here we go. So I've got the needle in on this end. And I'm just going to hold my hands on that needle. And I'm going to pull them out and just take my finger and come down through here. Just like this. So that when I get to the end, I can see how many beads I need to add on. So it looks like I need to add 2 more beads on my current strip. So what I'm going to do is take the needle back out, and I'm going to go ahead and add those last 2 beads really quick. So I'm going to, and make sure that I've still reinforced, and I'll show you again in a minute how great it looks when you take the time to reinforce each bead as you add it along, as you're working. And it doesn't have to be that precise. As long as you're pretty close, you can always add a bead on one or the other of your strips if you run into a little problem. So anyhow, let me reinforce my last bead here. So now I've got the last one on, and my strip has been reinforced all the way along, and look how beautiful it looks. Looks really pretty like the first one. I don't have any gaps in my beadwork. Looks really professional. So to end off your thread, all you need to do is weave back into your strip. And what I like to do is just weave forward 3 or 4 beads. Then I backtrack a bead or 2. And come back forward. Move forward a few more beads like so. Then backtrack 1 bead again. Then just do that a couple of 2 or 3 times, working your way back into your beadwork a little bit, and then it's really safe to end your thread, because you'll know that your thread is nice and secure and there's no danger of it coming out. And plus I'm going to be doing other beadwork throughout these strips, and that will even further more secure my work. I'll do one more little backtrack here. Back up 1. Then I'm going to move forward a couple, and I'm just going to cut my thread. Just like that. And then as I go to cut my thread, I pull tightly so that the little tail piece pops right down inside of the bead. And so now I have my 2 beautiful matching strips of these gorgeous bugle beads ladder stitched together, and everything looks really nice and very professional. Alright guys, so now I'm going to teach you guys how to add thread in a project such as this ladder stitch with the bugle beads. So what I've done here is I've just started 4 or 5 beads back towards the long length of the piece of beadwork, and I've stitched through one of my bugle beads and just left myself a really small tail. So now my thread is exiting to the top of the beadwork. I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to pass down through one of the beads beside where I'm exiting. And I'm adding a pretty long piece of thread here because I'm getting ready to show you guys how to create the center of this bracelet. So once I've pulled through, I want to go back up through that first bead I started from. And I call this making a loop-de-loop, because that's a good way to secure the thread without tying a knot. So you'll want to repeat that, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the bead on the opposite side of my starting bead and pass down through the one on the opposite side, if I can get it, and pull through. And then I would do the same thing, going straight back up through the very bead I started from. And that's a pretty secure thread, because basically now we're going to weave to the end of the strip by just passing down through and up through the beads until we get to the bead on the end. Now you also can go ahead and tie 2 overhand knots and pull the thread up into the bead, or the knot up into the bead, but I don't want to do that on this particular strip because I've got a lot of work to do going back and forth through my bugle beads as I build the center of the bracelet. So I'm just going to weave in at this point. And once I pass down through my end bead here, I can begin to work on the center of my bracelet and connect the two strips of my bugle beads together. And so there it is, looking like this right here. So because I have my tail thread here on the same side, I'm just going to basically leave it for now, and I will cut it off after I've woven past it as I work along. So for my first stitch to connect my two strips of graphite bugle beads together, you can change this up any way you want and make it as wide or as narrow of a band in between the two strips. So I want mine to be quite a bit of a statement piece, but not something totally overwhelmingly huge. So I have picked up a total of 5 more of my bugle beads once I was coming out of this strip. I let those drop down, and now I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go through the bugle bead on the end of my other strip. When I pull it all together, I can see how wide my bracelet cuff is going to be once it's finished. And I kind of like that width right here. I think it looks pretty nice. It's going to make a beautiful statement piece without being overwhelmingly wide like this. Another consideration you're going to want to take into effect is your clasping and how you intend on clasping the end of your bracelet. So for this particular piece, if I were to use lobster claws, I would probably use 2 or 3 lobster claws. And so that gives me the right amount of beads. I can attach one here at the end. I have a center bead here in the middle, and then I have my other bead here at the end where I could actually add 3 clasps to even give it a more stunning effect. And so now that I have those beads in place, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a row of square stitch bugle beads here on the end to shore up this first row of my center beads. And that also will, just give a better effect to the look of the bracelet. So I'm going to, coming out of this bead here, I'm picking up 1 bugle bead, and I'm going to pass back through that bead from the opposite side that my thread is exiting. And because it's a little bit wobbly, you'll just want to hold and don't pull too sharply because you have those sharp edges on your bugles. And you'll want to make sure that everything looks nice as you hold it in your hand like that. So now that bead is in place. I'm going to take my needle and come back through that bead from the bottom to the top that I just added. I know my thread's a little bit long, but I really prefer to work with a longer thread. If you're uncomfortable working with a long thread, you do not have to. You can add more thread as you work along. So I'm just going to repeat that until I have a bead beside each one of my bugles going up this line. So I've picked up another bead, and I'm coming down through the very next bead on my previous row from top to bottom. Pull that bead into position. It's very similar to the ladder stitch. We're just, we already have all of our beads loaded on, and we're working, vertically instead of horizontally. So then we just pass up through the bead we just added from bottom to top to get into position. Pull our thread. As you work on this row, you'll want to make sure that you snug your beads and secure them so that they look nice and professional as you work along. You can even lay the beadwork down and work from with your beadwork flat on your bead mat. So now I need to pick up my next bead. And I'm just going to repeat that till I have a bead added up here on this on the other strip. So I'm coming to show you one more time. I picked up my bead. I'm coming through that next bead on my previous row from top to bottom. I'll hold it with my fingers while I pull. Then before I pull too sharply on my thread, I'm going to position that bead a little bit because, like I said, they do have sharp edges. So now it's in place. I'm just going to take my needle and go back up through that new bead here from bottom to top. And when I pull, those beads sit nicely beside each other. So I'm going to jump off and do my last 4 just like that. And then I'll meet you folks back. So now I'm at the top of the beadwork and I'm adding my last bugle bead. I've got it on my needle. I'm going through the bead on the end of my other strip from top to bottom. I'm going to get that bead into position gently. Then I'm going to pass back up through my new bead there from bottom to top. And now we have our square stitch completed except for the final step, which if you've watched some of my square stitch videos before, you will know that you need to finish up and secure the work and make these ends really strong. We're going to pass down through all the beads again. So we're going to come down, I'm on this bead on the end, I'm going to come down through the bead beside of it, and I'm going to pass through all of the beads on that row, like this. I'm going to flip it over and make sure that I'm not skipping any beads, that I can't see my needle in between beads. That lets me know I haven't skipped anything. Then we'll pull that all the way through. Now I'm going to pass through all these beads on the end row here that we just added using square stitch. Now I'm just going to secure that up and secure those beads and straighten them up and make them look really pretty. And I'm going to make sure I'm not skipping any beads. Once again, like this. And pull it all the way through. And you'll be able to immediately feel the difference in how that beadwork feels on those 2 rows once you have done that step. And they look really pretty. So now we're coming out of this bead on the end. So we need to be coming out in the center of our beadwork. So all we have to do is pass down the inside row of square stitch beads here one more time. Making sure we didn't skip anything. Once we pull through, then we can come through the next bead going backwards on our strip from the bottom to the top, or excuse me, from the top to the bottom, so we're in the middle of our beadwork. And so now we're positioned to work on filling up our strips of beadwork here. And this is what you should have. So the beautiful thing about this, a project such as this, is that you can go any way you want with your filler beads. You can use bugles of the same color. You can use 8/0 beads, 6/0 beads, 11/0 beads, 15/0 beads, a different color of bugle beads, different sizes of bugle beads. You can basically, the possibilities are pretty much endless, is the point that I'm trying to make. You can make crisscrosses if you want to take the time to count, if that's the look you're going for. The particular look I have in mind when I started working on this project is just some beautiful wavy strips of beads down between each from one bugle bead to the one on the opposite side. You can use also larger beads. I'm just going to show this as an example. I would never use this button. However, you could use this button because it's a Swarovski button, and it does have a hole that you can sew through. You can put larger beads in the middle with other seed beads on both sides. It's just like this. It's just endless what you can come up with, and it's all up to your own creativity. So with that in mind, what I have done here is I've laid out a selection of beads that I want to use in the center of my beadwork. So I have these black diamond check glass beads here. They actually came in a mix with some hematite beads mixed in with them, and I have separated them out because I got them over at Hobby Lobby. I think I got them at AC Moore actually, but I really love this color. I did not like the 2 colors together, so I just picked through and separated them out, and they're really, really pretty. They're like a charcoal gray bead with silver lining inside, and these are 8/0s. And then I just have some other check glass 11O beads here, and they are just the plain crystal. They do not have the AB finish, but they're super beautiful. The check glass ones are so pretty. And then I have some same size bugles as the ones I used on my strips, which are about 5 millimeters. As you can see, they're pretty close to the same size. These are the graphite ones I used on my strips. And these are just a beautiful silver line crystal. And they're really good quality. And they're a check as well, Preciosa bugles. And they're really good quality and super shiny and pretty. So all I've done is dump out a selection of beads that I want to use to fill up my center with. Another design option on this bracelet would be you could continue on filling your center up using square stitch by stitching a certain number of beads onto the previous row of beads before it. What that would do is give you less flow and waviness to your center beads. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stitch straight across because I want my beads to be kind of loose and flowy, almost like a fringe in the center. And so they'll catch the light and it'll make it into a really beautiful statement bracelet. So here's a cute little trick for figuring out, how many beads you'll need in between your two outer strips. So I went ahead and picked up a certain number of these 8O beads, and I'm pretty sure I got 12 on here. But I'm not going to take them all the way off my needle, not yet. I'm just going to hold them onto my needle like this right here. Then I can just lay them gently into the inside of the beadwork like that. And that way I can match up to see how many I need to add. And in this instance, with these 8O beads, I would just simply need to pick up one more. So now I can let them all come down. And when I drop them into place up against the other edge where they're coming out of, like that, and then lay my thread down, I can see that they fit really nice inside of my frame. We'll call this a frame. And so that's that's one way you can pick up all of one size of one color. You can do a mix of colors. It's totally up to you how you want to go about filling this bracelet in. So I got that row added, and if you'll notice here, because I've used a lot of size 8O beads in these first few rows, my beadwork is starting to look a little bunchy. So for my next row, I'm going to start thinning it out just a little bit. So what I've got on my needle now are 5 11s, one of my silver bugle beads, and 5 more 11s. And so I'm coming out here at the top of the beadwork, so I know I need to come down through the 6th bead on the opposite side. And I do count a lot if my light is giving me trouble, or especially when I'm videoing, my light does give me a lot of trouble, so I do a little counting just to make sure that I'm correct, because I don't like to take my needle on and off and remove beads a lot. It damages your working thread. So now I've got a nice little skinny row in here, and I need to step back up through that very next bead. And it's easier to see on the outside. You really don't have to take the time to count because you can see where you're coming out and go through the next bead. It's just when you're in the center sometimes it's hard to look and see exactly where to go. But anyways, so and another tip while you're working, you don't want to pull those threads so super tight that you bunch all the beads up in the center. And if you feel like it's starting to bunch a little bit, you can just take it and wiggle it just a little like this and give the beads just a little bit more play in the center. And that's also going to give it, because I'm using those clears and the silvers, I'm getting an extra little pop of shine right there. So now I'm going to come back up through my 7th bead in order to get into position to add more beads. Just like that. The trick to this type of beadwork is to make sure that you're coming in and out of the correct beads when you're at the center of your beadwork. So that's really the most important part, to not having things bunch up on you or be too loose or have big gaps of open space in between your rows of beads. So what I'm going to do at this point is because I'm just doing this little random chaos patterning throughout the bracelet, I will try to write it all down for you guys and put it in the description, or I think what I'll do is just put it over on a blog post at the bead mat. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and keep working on filling up my bracelet. All right, so what I did, I came to this couple of conclusions as I was working along on filling up this beautiful bracelet. And so I'm going to share with you how everything came together. So the first thing I decided was I did not like the way that the 8/0 beads were causing a little bit of bunchiness into my beadwork. So because I had made my bracelet strips as separate components, it was super easy for me just to snip everything apart, and then I started again. So I started the same way with my square stitched graphite beads here on the end, and then I progressed into filling along on the inside. So another realization I had was that the distance of these 5 beads in the center, the 5 bugle beads here on our end, is the equivalent of, one bugle bead is the equivalent of 3 11/0 beads. So that started putting some, math to the problem. And so I could just know that every space I wanted to add seed beads, where a bugle bead was before it, I would have to pick up 3. And then I also decided to add, in lieu of the 8/0 beads I took out, I have some antique silver galvanized Toho 11/0 beads, so I swapped my 8/0s out for those. So then I went, got busy filling in my bracelet. And another thing that I decided to do was every so often, and you can see that this is still like a random patterning, and it's coming out beautiful. But every so many rows, I went ahead and did a row of all bugles, and then it came back through and I square stitched another row of bugles beside of it. And sometimes I did 3 or 4 rows of bugles and just kept mixing my colors up. Sometimes I did little rows of all seed beads, just like this. And I want you to see that it's really coming out beautifully. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys how to add those little rows of square stitched bugles every so often. And then, I'll show you a couple of more rows of how I added in some seed beads and things like that. And I hope that you're really going to like this project. This really is coming out so beautiful. All right, give me just a moment and we'll move on. So on my little last row here, what I did was I picked up 3 of my antique silver, a bugle, 3 antique silver, a bugle, 3 antique silver. I came down through the corresponding bead here and up through the next bead so that I'm into position to add more rows. And so what we're going to do first is I'm going to show you guys how to add some of these rows where I'm square stitched the bugle beads in the center. So I'm going to start by picking up 5 bugle beads, and I decided on this row I'm going to alternate my colors, and I'm going to start with the silverline crystal, then a graphite, silverline crystal, graphite, and end with a silverline crystal. So I'm coming out in the center, so I just need to jump over to the bead on the opposite side and make sure that I'm getting into the right bead and push through and pull my beads into position. Now, because I've gotten a little bit further in my work, I have to make sure that these flopping ends of my bracelet don't get caught up in my working thread. So I also discovered it's pretty easy to hold the work like this, and it eliminates some of that problem. So I've come through my bead here, and I need to go up through my next bead towards the center of the beadwork. Pull. So now we're ready to, we can do some square stitch. And I flip this work around a lot, but it's because it makes it a lot easier to work with to keep those ends hanging over my finger like that. So in this section, I'm going to put corresponding colors. So I'm coming out, and my previous row bead here is a silver. So I picked up a silver, and I'm going to come back through the silver on the previous row. And we'll position that bead and pull it nice and snug. Then I have to come back up through that new bead I just added. So come back through that new bead and pull the thread. So there's my first bead into position. My next bead is graphite from the previous row, so I'll pick up the graphite. I'm coming out of my new bead here. I'm going to go down through that graphite bead on the previous row from the top to the bottom, get it into position, and then I'll come back up through the graphite bead that I just added from the bottom to the top. The next one's silver, so here we go. Pick up the silver. We're going to come down through that silver bead. And I'm going to show you guys a couple of tricks that I also figured out while I was doing this bracelet. But we'll do this row just like this, one at a time. We'll pull our bead into position. Remembering our sharp edges, we don't want to pull too sharply on our thread. We're going to make sure our working thread doesn't get hung on any other beads as we come back up through the new bead. So I got 2 more to do. My next one's a graphite. I picked up my graphite. I come from the top to the bottom of the previous row graphite. Get the bead put into position. And then we're going to come up through our new bead from bottom to top. And make sure that we don't have a problem here. And I do. My needle was accidentally ran through that thread, if you can see. Hold on just a second, guys. I'll have to rethread the needle. I had snagged under one of my previous threads, and that's why it was trying to make a thread bridge show. So let me just come up through this bead. Now our thread bridge is hidden. So now we're going to do the last silver. I'm going to come down through the silver on the previous row. Position our bead. Come back through that new silver bead we're adding. And then I'm going to flip my work just so I can see better what I'm doing here. Now we have to come up through the next bead on the base row, or our strip. Right there. Pull it through. Don't get our little strips here hung up into our thread, which I think I just did. You pull it out here. It goes this way. Okay. And pull our working thread through. Now for square stitch, remember we've got to go through and reinforce our previous row. We're going to go through all of the beads and make sure we don't skip any. And I'm just going to go as far as I can. My needle's a little bit bent here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through those first few and check to make sure my needle's going through the beads, all of the beads. Then I'm going to come through the remainder of my beads and grab that bead on the base row. Pull my thread. I'm going to flip my work over here, and I'm going to come through that the last row we added and pick through them as best I can. If I don't get them all in one pass, it's no big deal. I can take the time to straighten my needle out with the pliers or get a new needle. This one is getting quite the bending. So now I'm going to come through my last 2 bugle beads here first before I come through my strip, because I want to make sure I'm going into the correct bead on this side, which is this one. Actually, I'm going through the wrong bead. So take your time and make sure that you pass through the correct bead on your strip, which is this one. Okay, so now we are ready to step back up into our next open bead here on the strip and get back into the center. So now I'm going to show you an easy way to do this. We'll go ahead and keep our same little pattern here just because it looks pretty cool. So I'm going to pick up my, this time I'm going to go ahead and pick up all 5 of my bugle beads. I'm going to pick up my silver, graphite, a silver and a graphite, and then a silver. Alright, so I went ahead and took those beads back off so I could straighten my needle out with my pliers. So let's go ahead and get our 5 beads on. So this was just a cute little way I figured out to do the same effect as square stitch. And it actually is square stitch, but we get to load all of our beads on at once. So I've got my 5 beads on. I'm going to go through my next bead on the opposite side just like we normally would if we were adding all of our beads at once. And now once I get over here, what I want to do is square stitch those 5 beads to the previous 5. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up through the base bead plus 1 on my previous row. I'm going to pull my thread through. Then I'm going to come down through that bead on the row I just added, the silver bead, back in the opposite direction, and pull. Now I'm going to come up through the silver bead and the graphite bead on the previous row. And this takes a little finagling, but it works exactly the same way. So once I'm going through that silver bead and that graphite bead, I'm going to pull my thread. I'm going to go back through the graphite bead from my new row I'm adding, just the graphite bead, and pull. Then I will go through the graphite bead on my previous row plus the silver bead. You can see that I'm adding those thread bridges just exactly the same as if I were adding these beads one at a time. So now I just need to come back through the silver on my new row. Now we're going to come down through the silver and the graphite on the previous row. Right there. We'll come up through just the graphite bead on our new row. And now we will come down through the graphite bead and the silver bead, the last silver bead here on our previous row. We're going to come up through just our silver bead on our new row. And this time we'll go down just the silver bead on the previous row, and plus we're going to go through the bead on the outside strip. Pull. And now we need to reinforce this new row we just added by taking our needle and going through all of those beads without skipping any till we're coming out on the other side. Double check on this side to make sure that you haven't skipped a bead, and pull everything through. So there's just a really easy way to work with these bugle beads doing square stitch without having to pull on those sharp edges so much. So now my thread is really short here. So I want to end this thread, and I probably let it get too short. So in lieu of ending it, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do one of my little famous loop-de-loop stitches here if I can get into a bead. I'm going to go coming out of the bead here, I'm going up the next one beside of it. Then I'm going to come right back down through that bead again, just like that. And I'm going to pull that off my needle. Then I'm going to start a new thread. So I'll cut a new thread and get it onto my needle, and I'll meet you guys back and I'll show you a couple more little tricks. Alright, so I'm going to show you how I'm going to get this thread added on because I had worked my thread way too short over here and I need to secure that thread. So I've added a good couple of wingspans of thread onto my new needle, and I got out a new needle, by the way, to work my thread in so that I'm exiting from this same bead here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down through one of my previous rows and work my thread all the way through. And I'm going to leave myself a little tiny tail thread on this side of my beadwork. So here's the thread I need to tie off. Here's my new thread. So I'm leaving my new thread a little tiny tail right here. And I'm working down this second to the last row that I added of beads. I'm just going to try to take my time and get through there because I don't want to skip any beads, but I also don't want to manhandle my previous rows so that I pull them out of shape or anything. So I'm going to take my time and I'll work over through there. And I'm still working with the long thread because I still have quite a ways to go up to finish filling up my bracelet. So I'm going to pull that and make sure I don't pull my tail thread, my new tail thread out. So now I'm down here to my the strip on the other side. So go ahead and pull that through. Grab my new tail thread so I don't mess things up. Now I can just come up through the next bead on my strip, like this. And now I can go pass down through the bead over here where my thread is currently situated. My old thread. So now I've got both of those threads coming out of the same bead. I'm just going to tie this off with 2 overhand knots. And I'm going to come back through my very last row of beads. So I'm going to come up through the bead on the strip and pass through all of my beads. I'm going to try to get through as many as I can this time without skipping any. And this time when I pull, I'm going to pull pretty sharp and pop that knot inside of my bead. And come back across to the opposite side. There's 2. And now I'm going to come down through the bead on the strip. I've already bent my brand new needle. Oh well. That's the way it goes. So now I'm over here exiting beside of my new tail threads. So I'm going to go ahead and tie those into a knot. Now my old working thread is over here, so I can get rid of that tail. But my new one, I haven't passed through any beads yet. So I'm exiting here. I'm going to come up the bead on my second to the last row here on the strip. Just that strip bead. Pull my needle through. This is why I didn't want to tie a bunch of knots through my bugle beads at the beginning, because I knew I would have to add thread and end thread. So now I'm going to come down back towards the outside of the strip bead here, closest to on my outside row, or my very last row. I'm having trouble getting my needle through there, but I will get it. So there we go. So I'm coming down that strip bead that corresponds to the very last row of center beads I added, and I'm going to pull this through. Make sure that my working thread isn't tangled up in my strip there. I'm going to pull nice and snug. Now I can pass up through the very next bead, and I'm ready to work on the center of my bracelet again. Work right in the right exact position. Now this thread is secure, and I can end this thread as well. So there's a good way that you can add an end threads into your project. So I'm going to show you a couple more little things here, and then I'm going to continue on till I finish the inside of my beautiful bracelet. But what I wanted to show you is, not only do you, like with these rows of seed beads where I added them all at once, there is other ways to work on this as well. You can pick up 3 seed beads and you can square stitch those onto the previous bugle bead or the previous 3 seed beads just by passing down through that previous bead like that. Pull your beads into position. Then you can come up through those 3 seed beads here that you're just now adding. And you can add a few blocks of square stitch beads like that, which I have done occasionally throughout the bracelet, like here for example. And then I followed it by a couple of loose rows, and then some square stitch rows, and some loose rows, and then square stitch my little 3 seed beads in. And just continue working. So then maybe I want to put 3 of my other color seed beads. So I'll pick up 3 of my crystal seed beads to contrast with this graphite bead here. Pull those in. Just like that. Then come up through just the 3 little crystal seed beads to get back into position to add more beads. So I've just been playing around with this bracelet the whole time, using square stitch here and there, using just regular straight across stitching, switching up seed beads and bugle beads, 2 colors of 11-ohs, 2 colors of my bugles, and this is how I've gotten to where I have so far. So I'm just going to continue playing around with my random patterning, and when I get down here to the end of my bracelet, I'll meet you guys back, and I'll show you how to wrap this thing up a little bit. So one thing I do want to mention, I had said at the beginning, I think that I'm using the 6-pound black satin Fireline. I love the way this does not turn your fingers black. It's so much better than the smoke gray. But you can use the smoke gray, you can use the crystal clear, whichever you like. The most important thing is about how much you're going to need. So I'll just be honest with you, to this point, between making my 2 strips of ladder stitch and then working the different rows of square stitch and straight stitching back and forth throughout this bracelet, I have already used about 6 to 8 wingspans of my Fireline. And a wingspan, once again, is from fingertip to fingertip with your arm stretched out wide. So it does take a lot of thread. Just so you know up front, you may want to make sure that you have plenty of your Fireline before you get started. Okay, so now we're finally going to wrap this up and put some clasping onto the bracelet. So what I've done is I put a new thread onto my needle, and I've sewn in. I tied off my tail thread from the start and pulled my knot up inside of a bead, and I'm exiting this first bead towards the center of the bracelet, just like that. So let's take a look at some clasping ideas. I happen to have a couple of these little 5-loop slide cheap clasps like this. You know, like the way that the bright silver contrasts with the bracelet. And I also got out a couple of lobster claw clasps, also in a brighter silver color. And I laid them out just to see what things look like and compare the way the clasping looks in this manner to make up my mind on how I want to proceed. And I think I'm going to go with the lobster claw on this particular bracelet, because on the opposite end I can add as many jump rings as I might need to create additional length as for options for selling the bracelet online or at a craft fair. So I've chosen to use 3 lobster claw clasps, and I'm going to position them on bead 1 here, then the bead in the middle, which is bead 4, and then on the opposite end here, which is bead 7. And I'm coming out to the right hand side of bead 1. So one thing I like to do when I'm adding clasp, just to give a little bit more of an elegant and professional finish, I like to use these little crimp tubes. I get a lot of them in some little packages of findings that I get at, craft stores. And these happen to be this beautiful black kind of gunmetal looking color. And there's lobster claws, earring wires, chain, jump rings, and these little crimp tubes. So I'm going to be using some of these. You don't have to use these. You can use matching seed beads from your project just as easily. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up 2 of those. I'm going to pick up one of my lobster claws, and I'm going to make sure that when I get ready to add the other lobster claws that I pick them up in the same way. So I'm passing through just the portion of the claw, of the clasp. And then I'm going to pick up 2 more of these little crimp tubes onto my needle. And now I'm going to pass back through the same bead I started from here, from the opposite side. And at the same time, I just want to make sure I'm passing through that one bead, because I'm going to go ahead and reinforce this clasping section as I add it before I move on to another one. So when I pull, you'll see that the 2 little crimp tubes position themselves on either side of my lobster claw. So now I'm going to reinforce, so I have to come up through the 2 crimp tubes on the same side, here the right hand side. Pull through. Then I need to make sure that I come through my lobster claw, and I'm going to go ahead and pass through that next crimp tube at the same time. And this keeps me from having any exposed thread. Now I'll come down through the last crimp tube here on the left, and then pass right back through this bugle bead that I'm working from here. And then I'm just going to repeat that, because I feel like it's always good to go through your clasp section at least 2 more times, so for a total of 3. So I went ahead and reinforced that section one more time by passing up through all the beads, coming through the lobster claw, down through the 2 crimp tubes on this side. And now I'm going back through my first bead, but at the same time I'm going to go ahead and push forward until I'm exiting the next bead I want to work with, which is the 4th bead in the center. And because I tied a knot there, it's a little bit tight, so I'm just going to use my pliers to pull my needle through. And pull all my thread through. And position my clasp just so. And now I'm just going to repeat that step for this part, adding the next lobster claw. Now what I want you to pay attention to here is how my thread is coming out here to the right, and how this lobster claw looks. So I'm going to move my needle into my right hand, and I'm going to hold this lobster claw in the same position as the previous one. Then I'm just going to go ahead and pull through. And that just makes sure that my second lobster claw lays exactly the same as my first one. I'll pick up my other 2 crimp tubes over here. And now I'm going to come back through that 4th bugle bead. Just slide the things off my needle. Sometimes it's easier to position your needle if you don't have other beads on there. So now when I pull it through, you can check to see that both of my lobster claws are facing the same way. So now I just need to reinforce this section twice, and I'll be right back. So I sewed through all those beads again, plus the center loop, connecting loop of my lobster claw 2 more times for a total of 3. I'm passing back through the bugle bead here in the center, plus I'm moving all the way through to the last bugle bead. And once again here we're just going to repeat the exact same steps for adding the 3rd lobster claw by picking up the 2 crimp tubes or beads. I'm going to place my needle over to my right hand and position this lobster claw correctly, then pass my needle through it. Drop it all down. Excuse me. And pick up my last 2 little gunmetal crimp tubes. before once again coming through that last bugle bead. To pull it all into position, check my work, make sure all my lobsters are facing the same way, and once again I'm going to reinforce this section twice. So I've finished reinforcing, and this is what my bracelet is looking like. Now, of course, you do not have to use 3 if you don't want to. You can use 2. You can use 1 here and 1 here. You can choose to put them in a bead, whatever you'd like to do. I just strongly suggest that you do reinforce, and don't skip that part, because obviously the clasping area is where your bracelet receives the most wear and tear. So now we need to get to the other end of our bracelet, and we can either weave all the way down, or we can tie this thread off and then sew back in at the other end, and that is what I'm going to do. So I'm exiting from this bead on the outer edge. I am going to go ahead and weave away from that edge just a little bit. So I'm just passing up the next bead on the outside strip, and then I am going to come down the next bead on my outside strip. And my beadwork's a little tight, but that's okay. I'll just take my time and get to where I need to be. So I'm just coming down 1. Pull through. And now I'm going to move up a little bit into the beadwork and tie a couple of 1/2-inch knots. So I'm going to come up the next bead, and I'm also working with one of these sections where I created a little bit of square stitch. So at the same time, I'm going to pass up a couple more beads. So I'm actually going to move up 3 into the center of the bracelet. It doesn't, you can choose anywhere you want to tie your 1/2-inch knots. Now, I'm going to take my needle, and I'm going to come under this thread bridge here, right between the 2 beads where my thread is currently exiting, and making sure I'm only getting in that 1 row of beads right there, and not the second row as well, just the 1. And I'm going to pull a little loop. I'm just going to take my needle, pass it right back through the loop, and gently pull my thread through until I see my knot coming down, because I want to make sure it falls into the same spot right there where I passed my needle through. And not get a knot too soon, so hold on just a second there. Alright, so then I just pull it into position and make sure that it falls between those 2 beads. That wasn't a good example because I almost created a knot. So let me just show you one more time. We'll just move through a couple more beads. And try it again to show you. I had to pull really sharp because I almost created a knot. So we're going to take our needle and pass under that thread bridge right there on that 1 row of beads. Pull slowly till we have a little loop. Pass through the loop with the needle. And then we're going to make sure that knot falls between the same 2 beads that our needle was exiting. Right there. Then we're going to move away by passing through some more beads. So I'm going to come through that next bead and then the bead on the opposite strip on the other side of my bracelet. Pull it all through. And then I'm going to tie just a few more. So I'm going to come back up through the very next row of beads, which also happens to be one of my square stitch rows. This time I'm just going to pass up through my strip bead and 1 towards the center and tie a knot. Move forward a few and tie another knot, just like we did on the previous ones. Making sure we're working with 1 row and not 2 when we dig under to catch that thread bridge. You pull it down in. Move through a few more beads and tie another knot. After you tie your final knot, you'll want to make sure that you move through a few beads before you cut your thread. And also, it's better to cut your thread in the center of your beadwork if possible. So when I move away from my last knot, I'm going to move down just 2 beads and not pass through that outside edge bead. I'll just be coming out of the bead right before it. Then I will just simply take my scissors and give a little sharp pull against it so the thread will suck into the beadwork and end the thread. So I've stitched into my opposite end. I've tied off the 2 tail threads, the one from adding my new thread in and the one that was from my beginning of building my strip. I am exiting the first bead towards the center here. I picked up on my needle 4 of my little crimp tubes, and you can use those or beads, like once again, and plus 1 jump ring. And I'm just going to do exactly the same thing on this end, only using a jump ring instead of the lobster claws. The only trick that you'll need to remember on this part is that as you stitch through your reinforcements, just make sure that you pass through the jump ring and don't skip over it. So we're going to come up through the 2 beads here on the right, because that's where my working thread is exiting the base bead. Then I'm going to come through this jump ring and come down through the 2 beads on the left, just reinforcing, and then pass through the bead on the base. Now you can, if you're using jump rings like I am, you don't have to add them into your stitching right now. You can always open and open them up and add them in after you've created the loop. I just go ahead and add it now, but it works just fine either way. And so now that I've pulled through, I'm going to do that again. I'm going to move forward and add my other 2. So I reinforced one more time on this little loop of beads in the jump ring. And now when I move back through my first bead again on the base, I'm going to push through till I'm exiting the 4th bead, just like we did on the opposite end. And I'll just repeat adding the little crimp tubes and jump rings here, reinforce twice, move to this bead, add my little section of beads, and reinforce twice. So now I've got my little sections of beads and jump rings added here on the opposite end. And I'm just going to go sew through and my thread just exactly like I showed you when we added the lobster claws. So here is my finished product. It's really beautiful. I hope you guys really like this tutorial. Here's what it looks like now. Sorry about the phone ringing there, but anyhow, here's what it looks like completed. Now this is not obviously my size bracelet, because I intend to sell this either through my friend at the art gallery who sells my work or on my website, but it's really beautiful. On this end, say I had a customer that needed an additional little bit of additional length. I have options here too where I can add either extender chain or just create extra length with some additional jump rings, matching jump rings. And it's really, really beautiful. So there it is, folks. I know it's been a little bit long, but I really hope that you like this project. It's a very elegant statement bracelet made with simple inexpensive seed beads. It's just, the stitching that gives this bracelet its spectacular appeal. All right, thank you so much for watching this class. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, make sure that you follow me on Skillshare and on YouTube. And also head on over to my website so you can check out all my other jewelry on the AlluringBeadBoutique.com. Head on over to the bead mat, which is thebeadmat.thealluringbeadboutique.com, and check out my blog. Make sure you sign up for my newsletters. And thank you so much for watching.